From the earliest morning hours in his small office at a local newspaper, Matthew Parker had sensed the day would bring something unusual. He had been reviewing notes and browsing through older articles when an unexpected telephone call arrived. On the other end of the line, there was an elderly woman identifying herself as Mrs. Brennan, who wished to share a long-kept secret. Her voice, although marked by age, conveyed an urgent curiosity and apprehension. She mentioned an old mining settlement named Granville, located in a remote, mountainous region west of the city, and insisted that a mass disappearance of its inhabitants had taken place there many decades earlier. According to her recollections, the entire population had vanished so abruptly and so thoroughly that even after several investigations, hardly any records of what truly happened remained. Matthew had encountered many local legends during his journalistic career. He had published articles on ghost towns and rumors of bizarre happenings, some of which turned out to be mere fabrications or misunderstandings. Yet something about Mrs. Brennan's tone and her striking confidence that morning made him decide to investigate. Although he remained skeptical at first, he agreed to meet her in person, anticipating that this might be another local myth, but also recognizing the potential for an exceptional news piece if there was any truth to the account. Upon arriving at Mrs. Brennan's cozy and somewhat old-fashioned home, Matthew noticed how meticulously she had prepared for his visit. She had laid out a variety of aging documents, photographs, and personal notebooks across her living room table. The pages of these documents bore dates from the 1950s, and many showed signs of repeated handling. Corners were frayed, ink was faded, and some articles were difficult to read due to the yellowed and brittle state of the paper. Everything she presented related in some way to the settlement known as Granville. According to the older woman's family memory, her aunt had lived in that settlement shortly before it was abandoned and had written unsettling letters describing eerie noises, peculiar happenings around the mine, and an oppressive fear that had spread among the residents. Mrs. Brennan provided a recollection that her aunt's letters contained references to strange chanting and occult markings near the mine entrance. There was also mention of how certain miners had become convinced they had unearthed something not belonging to the normal realm of nature. This was said to be the root cause of the panic that eventually gripped the community. The aunt's account made it clear that people felt a growing conviction that an otherworldly force had been stirred from the depths, compelling some individuals to organize clandestine gatherings or rituals in the hopes of appeasing or containing whatever had been found. The older woman, trembling slightly, believed that no one had ever come forward to reveal the details because outside authorities or powerful entities might have intervened to keep it hidden. Matthew, while listening and noting down everything methodically, sensed that the story, if partially accurate, might provide extraordinary material for an investigative piece. After thanking Mrs. Brennan for her willingness to share, he returned to his newsroom determined to examine any public archives related to Granville. He discovered rather quickly that open-source records regarding the settlement barely existed. In the newspaper's own files, there were only a few short mentions. References to a small mining operation that closed in 1957 and subsequent rumors of a sudden exodus of locals. A few lines pointed to alleged accidents, but there was no substantial data on why the population had effectively vanished, let alone any official statement concerning its fate. It was not surprising that modern references to Granville were scarce, since many ghost towns in the region had simply faded into collective oblivion. Still, it was unusual that no consistent explanation had been documented. Seeking more clarity, Matthew contacted an acquaintance named Richard Holt, a researcher affiliated with a local museum dedicated to regional history. Holt confirmed that Granville was a matter of whispered lore among museum staff. Some believed the settlement had succumbed to a disastrous mining collapse or lethal gases that had leaked from underground. Others speculated that its people had discovered evidence of a prehistoric or even alien presence, leading to clandestine government involvement. The museum lacked an official exhibit on Granville, which made Holt suspect that comprehensive records might have been lost or deliberately removed from the public eye. He did, however, recall conversations among local enthusiasts about weird symbols found in or near the old tunnels, suggesting a level of cult-like or ritualistic practice. This alone sparked Matthew's interest further, especially when he reflected on Mrs. Brennan's aunt's letters. The reporter realized there could be a much deeper puzzle concealed in the old ghost town. After analyzing all these fragmented hints, Matthew concluded that the best course of action was to travel to the presumed location of Granville, accompanied by one or two colleagues, and attempt to gather direct evidence. He enlisted Tom Reynolds, an experienced photographer and longtime friend, and also Carrie Harrington, a young videographer who was eager to film documentary material in forgotten places. Their plan was simple: spend a day or two traveling to that remote corner of the region, locate any existing remains of the settlement, document what they found, and if possible, locate locals who might recall the events more concretely than just folklore. Before departure, Matthew studied topographical maps from the 1950s, cross-referencing them with more modern satellite images. He identified a series of twisting roads leading to a mountainous area. Officially, that route now ended several miles before Granville's approximate position, implying the final stretch would be unimproved or even entirely overgrown. He advised Tom and Carrie to pack extra supplies, including water, basic first aid gear, flashlights, a sturdy crowbar, protective masks, and backup batteries for cameras and lights. Meanwhile, he hoped that the cooler autumn weather would keep the roads passable. He suspected that in heavy rainy seasons or winter conditions, the trails would be even more treacherous. On the morning of their journey, they set out in a plain SUV provided by the newspaper. It had four-wheel drive and ample space for their equipment. Early on, traffic on the main road was light, and after an hour, they left the highway for a smaller route. Another hour later, as the elevation rose, the asphalt began to deteriorate, revealing cracks, holes, and occasional ridges formed by tree roots. They encountered no signposts marking Granville's direction, but they did see old broken fence lines, partial structures, and the remnants of farmland, all heavily reclaimed by nature. Eventually, they came upon a dilapidated farmhouse that matched an old reference on Matthew's map. It seemed to be a property once associated with the outskirts of the settlement. Matthew, Tom, and Carrie parked the vehicle near what had once been the farmhouse's front yard. The building itself looked as if it might collapse at any moment. Large sections of the roof had caved in, and most exterior walls leaned precariously. Broken windows offered glimpses of rotted wood and mold-eaten furniture within. Upon closer inspection, they discovered small hints that this had once been part of a lively homestead, an old well in the back and a weathered sign that bore only the letter G and a barely visible arrow. From the scraps, they interpreted that G likely pointed toward Granville. The overall location possessed a bleak, unsettling atmosphere, but it fueled their determination to find more definitive evidence. Following the direction of the sign, they navigated deeper into a forested road that became increasingly narrow. Finally, the trees opened onto a clearing. Scattered across it were several decrepit wooden houses, some partially burned, others nearly collapsed. It struck Matthew that this might indeed be the heart of Granville. Most likely, more structures had once existed beyond the visible perimeter, but time, weather, and possibly other factors had taken their toll. The hush that enveloped the place was striking. There were hardly any birds, and the wind felt heavy. The group parked once again and decided to perform a methodical exploration. They walked among the remains, noticing detail after detail: collapsed porches, rusted bed frames, torn curtains fluttering in broken windows, and occasional heaps of shards that might have once been kitchenware or personal belongings. An overwhelming sense of abandonment pervaded the settlement. It resembled a ghost town, typical of mines that had exhausted their resources. Yet something about the abruptness of the departure felt different. In places, it looked as though the residents had left behind everyday items in disarray, as if they had intended to return shortly or had fled in a moment of panic. Matthew found it especially odd that almost no personal papers or photographs remained. Usually, in old deserted communities, one can find bits and pieces: family portraits, letters, or diaries. Here, any traces of identity were missing. He suspected that if people had been forced to leave, they or someone else might have meticulously removed or destroyed records. The emptiness implied either a very organized evacuation or a subsequent cleanup, which supported Mrs. Brennan's perspective that an unknown party wanted to conceal the real story. The three decided to split up for a more thorough survey. Tom headed toward a row of derelict houses on the western side, while Carrie wandered toward what might have been the settlement's central area. Matthew examined an old structure that possibly served as a general store based on the presence of broken shelves and a sign partially reading "Groceries" on the ground. Pushing open a rotting door, he confronted rows of warped wooden fixtures and the remains of a front counter. The building smelled of mold, damp wood, and layers of dust that had accumulated for years. Through a beam of light from his flashlight, he glimpsed battered cans, their labels almost completely eroded. Closer to a rear storage space, he discovered a large wooden cabinet with a metal latch that had rusted shut. Forceful effort allowed him to unstick the latch, revealing an assortment of ledgers and notebooks from the mid-1950s. Each had water damage, but some pages were still readable. A ledger listed items like sugar, flour, and kerosene with order dates, with the last entry in early April 1957. Another notebook recorded debts owed by local families, as if the store sold on credit. The final pages ended abruptly, suggesting that routine commerce stopped without warning. Beneath these ledgers, Matthew noticed an even more curious find: a folded sheet of paper covered in ominous symbols. It depicted a circular motif ringed by smaller geometric shapes and intersecting lines. Some markings resembled a combination of Latin letters and unknown script. The text scrawled on one side made oblique references to whispered noises at night and an imminent danger. He carefully tucked away this strange paper for later study. After about an hour, the three regrouped next to their vehicle. Tom, who had explored the western area, mentioned coming across a small notebook that appeared to belong to a teacher. The pages spoke of local children who had ceased playing outdoors after sunset, frightened by footsteps and unclear voices drifting out of the surrounding forest. The teacher's notes implied a rising sense of collective fear, as well as unexplained incidents involving missing pets and nights broken by uneasy screams. Carrie had similarly unsettling news. In her exploration of the northeastern edge, she had discovered a barricaded door set into the side of a rocky hill. This door, partially concealed by bushes, was banded with metal strips and secured by a modern-looking padlock. She concluded it was likely the main entry to the now abandoned mine. More disturbing was her claim that she briefly saw a human figure standing in the shadows among the nearby trees. When she called out to them, the person slipped away without a trace. Neither Matthew nor Tom had expected to see evidence of recent human activity in a settlement that had been devoid of official residents for so many years. Though intrigued, they realized that the day was waning and that entering a sealed mine at dusk would be hazardous. They returned to the nearest small town where they could find a motel. The plan was to gather better tools the following morning, such as a crowbar, to attempt opening the mine's padlock. They wanted to see if any official or private company was still maintaining the place. However, that night, while resting in the motel, Matthew received an anonymous call. The muffled voice on the other end identified him by name and warned him not to investigate Granville further, implying that doing so might lead to personal harm. This development only deepened his resolve, although it also heightened his sense of unease. By the next day, a subdued but persistent courage motivated the group to return to Granville. They navigated once more to the rocky slope where the locked door stood. The thick metal padlock proved resilient, but with collective effort, they finally broke it. Heavy, weathered hinges let out a grinding noise as the group pried open the door. The darkness inside the shaft yawned before them like a cavernous tunnel. At first glance, it seemed deserted. Old wooden bracing lined the walls, many beams chipped or partially rotted, and patches of wet ground glimmered under their flashlights. Rusted rails for a small mining cart system ran into the depths, suggesting that the main work had proceeded fairly far beneath the hillside. Venturing inside, they moved slowly, wary of structural weaknesses and any potential collapses. The air grew colder the farther they went, as if exhaled from deeper below. Water dripped intermittently, forming shallow puddles that reflected their flashlight beams in wavering patterns. At intervals, Carrie set up a tripod to record video footage, while Tom snapped photos of anything noteworthy. Their search quickly revealed that the walls, in certain stretches, were marred by strange graffiti or carvings, swirling patterns that resembled the shapes on the paper Matthew had discovered. It was as though, at some point, the mine had been used for more than just extracting minerals. After perhaps 30 meters, they encountered a side tunnel that had been sealed off by planks. A faded sign read B shaft or B section. They also noticed a warning about instability or collapse risk, which made them pause. Carefully removing the boards, they slipped through into another passage that sloped downward and eventually expanded into a broad chamber carved out of natural rock. Beneath the harsh beams of the group's flashlights, they observed scattered remnants of wooden crates and older mining tools left to decay. A row of rough tables stood near one of the walls, now overturned and broken, as though someone had abruptly disrupted the area. On the chamber's far wall, the team discovered the largest and most ominous variation of the circular design they had encountered. Bright red paint, or possibly some other pigment, had been used to create an elaborate arrangement of swirling lines and cryptic characters. The pattern spanned several meters in diameter, dominating that portion of the stone. Melted wax drippings appeared in clumps along the floor near this symbol, many of them relatively fresh in appearance, which strongly suggested that certain individuals had visited and performed candlelit rituals there more recently than the 1950s. Matthew uncovered something more: a battered metal cabinet lying open in one corner. Inside, beneath rusted medical kits and moldy cloth, sat a weathered folder of company documents. Glancing through the fragmented files, he pieced together the remains of an unsettling story. Handwritten notes described how, in early 1957, some miners extracted unusual geological samples or possibly unearthed fossilized structures that defied classification. The notes mentioned an official hush order. Someone higher up in the mining company had commanded the workers not to speak publicly about their find. Further accounts from an unknown writer reported hearing strange moans echoing in the deeper tunnels at night. Another snippet referred to gatherings in which certain townsfolk performed protective or appeasement ceremonies. It all pointed to an escalation of paranoia, culminating in events that were abrupt and, for many, presumably catastrophic. By the time the group finished gathering what documents they could carry and stepped back toward the entrance of the mine, they realized that their investigation had touched a raw nerve for someone. Two unknown men, dressed in dark clothing, were standing outside, positioned as if to confront them. These men demanded that any documents or materials taken from the mine be handed over. Their presence signaled that Granville and its secrets were under active surveillance, most likely by individuals connected either to a current private enterprise or an organization determined to keep certain truths hidden. Tension escalated as the journalists refused to surrender their evidence. The confrontation hinted that the men would use force if necessary. However, noticing the cameras and the possibility of an immediate public outcry if violence ensued, the strangers backed off, issuing threats before leaving in haste. Fearing that the intruders might return with reinforcements, Matthew and his companions hurried out of Granville and drove back to the nearest town. There, they secured themselves in a motel and proceeded to duplicate all discovered documents by scanning them into digital form. They understood that if someone planned to confiscate or destroy the physical evidence, having digital backups could be crucial to preserving the story. Later that evening, Matthew tried to contact Mrs. Brennan to keep her informed of recent developments, only to find that her phone went unanswered. Feeling uneasy about her silence, Matthew visited her home the next day. He found the front door ajar and the interior in disarray. Piles of scattered papers and drawers left ajar suggested a ransacking. There was no sign of the elderly woman who had brought this entire affair to light. Reports from neighbors indicated that a car, never before seen in the area, had been parked at her residence the previous day, but no one had noted a license plate or recognized the driver. Matthew contacted the local police to file a missing person report. Officers inspected the scene and recorded statements, but their initial stance was that Mrs. Brennan might have left voluntarily, or at least there were insufficient signs of a struggle. Matthew remained unconvinced and feared something ominous had happened to her. Realizing that time was pressing and that uncertain forces might soon close in on them, the three journalists decided to assemble their findings in a comprehensive article. They collated the notes, photographs of the settlement, and references to the bizarre symbols within the mine. The data painted a highly disturbing portrait of Granville's final days. A probable discovery of anomalous remains beneath the earth, an ensuing wave of panic or hysteria among the miners, and possible infiltration of occult beliefs that seemed to have been practiced in secrecy. Further suspicion surrounded the question of an external power, perhaps the mining corporation or a government entity, covering up these events to prevent public alarm. The documents also hinted at far more direct forms of interference with local residents, which could have involved forced relocation or worse. Although the newspaper's editorial board expressed caution about printing unverified claims, it agreed to release the story, given that Matthew had enough corroborating images and statements to pose serious questions about the official narrative of Granville's demise. The piece was published under a provocative headline about a community that vanished overnight in 1957, leaving behind cryptic marks of an unsettling nature. The article's impact on readers was immediate. Many were fascinated or horrified, while others dismissed it all as a hoax. Some longtime locals revealed that they had faint childhood memories of hearing about a mining settlement that simply ceased to exist. A small subset of readers strongly believed in the supernatural and saw this as confirmation of malevolent forces lurking within forgotten tunnels. The modern successor to the old mining company released a statement denying any wrongdoing. Its representatives suggested that the journalist team had trespassed, and they hinted at possible legal action, though in the end, no definitive lawsuit materialized. Observers suspected that launching a high-profile legal battle would only draw more attention to the revelations, which was precisely what the corporation seemed intent on avoiding. In the following weeks, the article stirred enough intrigue that self-proclaimed urban explorers and ghost hunters attempted to locate the settlement. Videos began circulating on internet platforms, showing glimpses of abandoned houses and the exterior of a mine, though many were produced with sensational or dubious content. The more genuine explorers reported that the paths to the site were being blocked by security personnel who seemed unofficial, yet were clearly there to discourage intrusion. Rumors abounded that the mine was being resealed or even flooded to eradicate any trace of the original excavation. Every rumor fueled the notion that a significant conspiracy might still be at work. Meanwhile, the disappearance of Mrs. Brennan remained unresolved. Neighbors and a few friends remembered her as a somewhat reclusive widow with a deep interest in local history, but they had no leads about where she might have gone or been taken. Despite repeated queries, the police claimed that no conclusive evidence linked her to criminal activity or indicated foul play. Matthew remained convinced that her interest in Granville had placed her in jeopardy, but he could not prove it. The sense of helplessness weighed on him, as though he had inadvertently led her to danger by engaging with her story in a public way. Over time, Matthew Parker continued his other journalistic assignments. Yet, the Granville affair never left his mind. Late at night, he would recall the ghostly silence of the deserted houses, the chilling atmosphere of the mine's corridors, and the bizarre symbols scrawled on the walls. He had come to suspect that the missing residents did not simply decide to leave. In his estimation, they had either been forcibly removed to ensure that the mine's secret, whatever it was, remained undisclosed, or had encountered some catastrophic event that ended their lives. He pondered the aunt's letters describing nighttime whispers, along with mention of unknown shapes glimpsed at the tree line near the settlement's outskirts. The notion that these individuals, living half a century earlier, had felt themselves surrounded by a presence they could not rationally explain, continued to disturb him. Although the official stance was to dismiss the entire situation, Matthew received intermittent communications that left him uneasy. Anonymous notes would appear in his mailbox, cautioning him against pursuing the story further. He remained unsure whether they came from fanatics, corporate agents, or some other fringe group that identified with the darker side of the legends. His editors occasionally asked if he had new leads, since the original feature had gained traction and broadened the newspaper's readership. However, his prime sources were exhausted. The settlement itself lay behind a wall of secrecy, threatened by partial demolition or heavy security. Mrs. Brennan remained missing, and none of the region's older residents were willing to speak openly on the record. At the same time, more outlandish claims proliferated online. Theories about alien artifacts, portals to other dimensions, or secret government labs. These claims muddled the real discussion, overshadowing the quiet terror that might have been inflicted upon ordinary families if a powerful entity had decided to strike them off the map. Matthew found it disheartening that the seriousness of the matter, namely that real people vanished, was turned into fantasy-laden speculation by sensationalists seeking attention. Months passed, and the memory of Granville began to fade from public conversation. Enthusiasts still exchanged theories in specialized forums, but the mainstream interest waned. The settlement itself decayed further as nature reclaimed roads and buildings. Some travelers who tried to reach the place claimed that it was heavily guarded and that their vehicles were turned away by unknown watchmen. Others insisted that they had seen odd lights glimmering among the ruins at night, describing them as flickers that moved in ways inconsistent with mere flashlights or natural phenomena. Without verification, these stories remained anecdotal, but they persisted as part of the settlement's growing legend. Reflecting on the most plausible scenarios, Matthew suspected that the mine might have contained something geologically or historically unprecedented, likely explaining the abrupt corporate shutdown in 1957. After possibly witnessing phenomena that defied ordinary science, local workers and residents might have either lapsed into collective fear or become involuntary participants in a secret that was too big to be revealed. In the most extreme view, there had been suggestions that certain individuals had turned to forbidden rituals in an attempt to control or repel a force they interpreted as malevolent. Meanwhile, the corporate higher-ups, or perhaps some branch of officialdom, had taken decisive steps to ensure that no one would ever learn the full truth. Everything he and his colleagues had seen, threatening phone calls, strange watchers, a suspiciously new lock on the mine door, and menacing instructions to relinquish all evidence, pointed to active protection of that secret even long after the settlement had fallen silent. Yet Matthew recognized that none of this conclusively explained the final disappearance of Granville's entire population. He was aware that ghost towns can empty out swiftly when industries fail, but typically a trace of evidence, public records of relocation, leftover possessions, or some transitional arrangement, remains. Here instead, the evidence indicated that people had left behind half-eaten meals, dusty personal items, or half-completed daily chores, adding a sense of unnatural haste. This difference had led him to suspect not just economic collapse, but a dramatic incident or forced evacuation. In the end, the unresolved nature of Granville's history formed the heart of the published article. Readers discovered that a seemingly ordinary mining town might hold a disturbing legacy of possible ritual practices, corporate censorship, an unidentified presence within the mine, or a combination of all three. Some remained convinced that the settlement's inhabitants had carried out macabre rites that unleashed something unstoppable, while others leaned toward the simpler notion that a corporate cover-up had overshadowed an environmental disaster. Whatever the exact cause, the consequences included an entire community erased from the map, leaving only crumbling walls and incomplete notes as silent testaments to their fate. Even as time wore on, Matthew would lie awake at night, revisiting the images of that large painted symbol, the melted candle stubs, and the sense of oppressive darkness inside the mine's deeper corridors. He recalled how easily a handful of armed strangers had confronted his group without the slightest hesitation. That memory underscored the possibility of ongoing covert activity. His attempts to confirm whether geological anomalies had ever been properly analyzed in official labs led nowhere, as such records did not appear in public databases or academic journals. It pained him that Mrs. Brennan, who had merely wanted answers about her relatives, had been swallowed by the same shadows. In whispered reflections, Matthew considered whether he had a moral obligation to push the investigation further. Yet, the absence of leads and the repeated threats suggested that he had reached a natural limit. He had already made the story known to the public, ensuring that others might one day pick up the trail. Perhaps future researchers or a dedicated team with better legal support would uncover additional documents or physical evidence. Meanwhile, the remote hills and forests that hid Granville would continue to harbor its untold truths, leaving behind a heavy question: could something intangible still dwell beneath the surface, in the silent tunnels where old rails gleamed faintly in the gloom? Thus, the enigma remained. The settlement known as Granville was recorded on few maps. It had originated as a minor project of a mid-20th century mining company that had promised prosperity to a small group of workers and their families. Over the course of 5 years, the company extracted ore from the region, and if the official record was to be believed, the deposit was soon exhausted, causing closure of the mine and relocation of the population. Yet the testimonies that emerged decades later shattered this simplistic narrative, introducing hints of a darker reality at odds with standard corporate practice. The obscure references to chanting, occult emblems, and hushed terror leading to a single night's catastrophic emptiness had become impossible to ignore. Journalists, historians, conspiracy theorists, and everyday curious readers all encountered the same puzzle. How could an entire community, with houses, families, and everyday routines, vanish in such a final manner, leaving behind barely any sign of deliberate packing or systematic departure? If the official timeline was unreliable, and if the company had forcibly removed or otherwise harmed the residents, why had no insider ever come forward with a confession? There were suggestions that, at the time, untraceable intimidation, combined with a general ignorance of one's legal rights, might have forced people into silence. Others believed that after the settlement disappeared, the inhabitants had been scattered under new identities, sworn to secrecy, or perhaps not survived at all. Matthew Parker's article, supplemented by the disturbing photographic and video evidence gathered by Tom and Carrie, was the fullest public account of Granville in recent memory. It attracted attention for a short while, then faded as the news cycle moved on. Nonetheless, the settlement maintained a lingering influence among those who studied local folklore, unexplained events, and lost histories. Through repeated retellings, Granville became a kind of cautionary tale about the perils of delving too deep, whether literally by drilling into unknown strata or figuratively by exploring mysteries that powerful interests wish to keep hidden. In the end, the place itself remained in unyielding silence, overshadowed by the possibility that an ill-defined malevolence still lurked in the shattered tunnels. No official body attempted to open a new investigation, and no direct link was established between the vanished settlement and the corporate or government entities rumored to be complicit. Random visitors continued to share strange anecdotes. Faint chanting heard near the mine entrance at dusk, footprints in the dirt that halted abruptly without reason, or bizarre symbols drawn in fresh paint. Yet these accounts, lacking direct corroboration, merely wove themselves into the tapestry of legends that now encircled Granville. Over time, nature steadily reclaimed the dusty paths, while scattered walls and roofless rooms fell apart to the steady intrusion of vines. It was in this steady decline of the physical site that the final echo of Granville's tragedy seemed to blend with the unstoppable erosion of memory. Several families had once planned their futures there, trusting that the mining company would provide them with a stable livelihood. Children had presumably run along the now silent paths, and mothers had likely prepared meals in kitchens that still contained rusted appliances half buried in debris. Yet the historian in Matthew mourned the near-complete absence of personal artifacts, as if every photograph and letter had been methodically eradicated. The overarching question, whether by ominous design or by a natural wave of fear, remained the same. How can a functioning community vanish from existence so comprehensively? In the final analysis, Matthew's personal reflection on the Granville affair took shape as a testament to the complexity of uncovering truths long buried by time and possibly by purposeful deception. He had gathered enough evidence to show that something profoundly disturbing had happened there, yet not enough to define precisely what that something was. Even the disappearance of Mrs. Brennan, the woman who originally spurred him to investigate, spoke to a larger, unresolved fate. The story that began with a phone call unveiling an old memory ended in a labyrinth of speculation, missing persons, and intangible dread. Granville thus joined the realm of mysteries that might never be fully clarified, overshadowed by corporate disclaimers, overshadowed by local authorities reluctant to become involved, overshadowed by decades of intangible rumor. It now stood as a cautionary footnote in the region's hidden history, a place where industrial ambition, possible paranormal experiences, and human desperation had collided, only to be swallowed by a hush that had lasted for decades. Even if, one day, a new generation uncovered the ultimate facts, the legacy of that hush would remain, reminding anyone curious enough to look behind the veil that certain revelations come at a heavy cost. And so, Matthew's investigation reached its unavoidable conclusion without closure. The settlement, overrun by trees and decay, remained a silent monument to unanswered questions, a swirling confusion of half-examined clues, missing inhabitants, and cryptic signs left on walls. In that profound, uncanny silence, a faint possibility lingered that the vanished townspeople might have descended deeper into the earth, crossing some boundary between what is real and what should not be awakened. Perhaps they had left traces in the tunnels far beyond the sealed doors, but no one seemed eager to retrieve them. The ancient markings in the mine, the missing letters, and the intangible sense of presence lurking in every corridor were enough to discourage further intrusions. In the end, Granville's story persisted as both a piece of local lore and a testament to humanity's fear of the unknown. Few now visited or cared to confront the oppressive aura that seemed to cling to the battered remains. The solemn hush served as both memorial and warning. Granville lay silent, its mysteries unspoken, an echo of a past that refused to rest beyond the grasp of complete understanding or final explanation.